Okay.
Okay. Let's talk a bit about fashion packaging. Briefly, if there was any about, you thought, conscious decision to package the Stones and the Beatles,
Right.
and then going to talk about the Sex Pistols and sex.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Go on. What do you want me to lead?
About fashion packaging.
Well,
was it consciously done for the Beatles, and then did you consciously do it for the Sex Pistols?
I think that it wasn't a conscious package with either group. I think that with respect to the Beatles, they were obviously aware at that time the image became very, very important. It was something that everybody could lock into. It was something that people could talk about. I think that the key with fashion in rock and roll success in terms of promoting various singers or groups was the fact that it's much more exciting to read about the group's image than to read about the group's music. You don't really want to read words that talk about the music. It's not interesting. The music is a given. If you haven't got the music, forget it anyway. So, in those days, they began to realize that what kids wanted to talk about was what they stuck up on their wall, which was the look of Elvis Presley, the big colour group photograph of the Rolling Stones, and these giveaways that now and again appeared in various pop magazines and Fleet Street journals and whatever journals existed in America, were the early days really of merchandising rock and roll, and fashion photography and grooming suddenly started to loom on the horizon as groups began to pet themselves. Makeup was always used on male performers, I think right back to Elvis Presley, but it became more flagrant. You'd flaunt it. You'd even perpetrate the idea of it as a style to look different. So you'd exaggerate it and you'd walk down the street with it. And groups like the Kinks, I think the Rolling Stones, as years rolled by, they changed. They became more chameleon and took on whatever was, tougher and more, whatever was more happening at that moment in terms of image making. And it obviously must have triggered a great deal of people who were in the rock and roll industry, from the record company's point of view, that they had to start selling the group by its look as much as by its music. Well, that was going to be very difficult, simply because they hadn't been trained in this way. They trained to hear a note that's in tune, a note that's out of tune, a rhythm, a harmony, a lyric. They could relate all this to music in the past, but they weren't hairdressers, they weren't tailors. It seemed extremely effeminate, and they in fact disliked it. It was difficult. And I think that they had a very uneasy time dealing with it, and ultimately left it to managers. That's what happened, I think.
Now, let's go on to you and the Sex Pistols. Was it a conscious image you were trying to do? Was it a statement against society or a comment on it? Or were you trying to imitate rock and roll and merely update it?
I think that again, like a lot of the clothing, always associated with rock and roll. I can't cite a situation yet. Maybe in the 80s you probably can, as things got more and more manufactured. But going back to that period of the middle 70s, at that time I could not cite anything that said the fashion came after the group, or the fashion was always there. It often preceded the group. The group basically harnessed itself to the fashion. I mean, Teddy Boys existed before they saw Bill Haley. Teddy Boys just had a better time Teddy Boying it up when Bill Haley arrived. The Rolling Stones and the Beatles existed after, in terms of style, than after Pierre Cardin's round jacket. They just locked in with those things. Otherwise, perhaps Pierre Cardin's Beatles-style collar, as it became known, would have probably just existed on the periphery with a few gay guys and some weirdos. It would have never become common street market fashion unless it travelled through this voice of the youth, this rock and roll group. So me in fashion at the time, owning a store on the King's Road, knew fully well that if I had an idea, like Pierre Cardin or Christian Dior or any designer, the way for that idea to work would be to channel it through music. So I had opened a store originally to sell old retro. I was a retread. I was one of those early retread stores, probably the original one in London anyway, that sold in 1971 rock and roll clothing of 1951. Old clothing. And then finally, when the store ran out, or my sources ran out, I would try to recreate it. I sold rock and roll records, and I sold this potpourri of rock and roll memorabilia in a shop that was known as Let It Rock on the King's Road. Now, it stood very close to a whole field of glitterdom, which was in those days lurex jacketed dandy fashions, with shops like Granny Takes a Trip, of which Keith Richards, the Kinks, and all other rock and roll groups continued to harbour. This shop was different. It was creating the 50s. Now, all those characters came into the store because it reminded them of their early inspirations. Well, I finally got rid of that style because it was also retrogressive, and I wanted to do something new and something of the day. Well, in 1974, I decided that I had no use for rock and roll clothing like that. I was trying to find a rock and roll style that was as tough, that could create as much scandal, that would be something that would start a whole new wave and look at clothes. And it wasn't so much to do with a style or a cut of a piece of cloth. It was more to do with the attitude of clothes itself. And if I thought about the 50s and about clothes that were really to demonstrate your sexual prowess, whether you're stuffing Kleenex tissues inside a bra that was often sewn into your dress, or whether you were putting bunches of petticoats under your skirt and cinching in your waist, this was this hourglass shape. Could I suggest that fetish clothing that was often sold in brown paper bags through the post from little small lads in the bottom columns of old crusty conservative newspapers, something to throw open the doors and sell on the open market in the middle of what had become this 70s kids, teenage, awful merchandising fashion street called the King's Road? Could I throw right in the middle of all that black rubber, whips, chains, tit clamps, you know, extraordinary fetish items, and imagine all these little girls coming out of school and boys who were maybe working in garages and banks suddenly walking into their prospective jobs with rubber t-shirts, rubber skirts, leather chains, the whole bloody lot. I thought, wow, this is an extraordinary, exciting premise. So I did the shop. I went out and searched for all these tiny little strange places where they manufactured such rubber goods. which were all basically simple items: a rubber t-shirt, a rubber skirt, leather trousers, leather t-shirt, leather jackets, studded bracelets, dog collars, cock rings, which were these big chromium plated rings that you used to on your cock, so your dick kind of projected outwards somewhat, so it kind of shook amongst the flies, and you know, on your trouser. And I loved it all, because it was all like very modern, very open, and very much dealing with this sexuality that it had a kind of an amusing air. It was, again, if I was to relate it to Christian Dior, here was the guy, little did he know, was whirling away and had done for years, making his little fetish garments for a few hoity-toity aristocratic ladies to sort of mess around in their homes, and a few kind of strange members of parliament who might get into all sorts of naughty deeds in the backwaters of Pimlico with some, you know, major prostitute. Little did they know we were going to throw it onto top of the pops. We were going to field it right across the King's Road. You were going to see it in all your local discotheques. This was what was extraordinary, and that gave me a great fuel and excitement. Well, I opened that store. I called it Sex. I had these big, huge pink vinyl cushiony letters. To look at it from the outside, the windows were all frosted. You couldn't see inside. It would look, from an ordinary bystander, a sort of a strange sexual brothel, come rub down, come adult movie, come whatever. And we would obviously entertain such clients. And inside, I completely foam rubberized all the walls and spray painted very quickly and very simply, in a very graffiti-like fashion, all little voyeuristic, sexy pages out of various sex novels. You know, Gladys and Irene going down on each other and drinking at their well of true desire, and so stuff. Does passion end in fashion? And this was all sprayed over, and there I was hanging all these black vinyl, trousered, leather, rubber, corseted type clothing. And I started to print fetish items on T-shirts. I took it outside of the pure fetish garment and started to make comment with it. Started to use a big leather mask, which was an image of a terrible rapist actually committed rape in this town of Cambridge. And so I did this T-shirt, and I used the musical notes at the top and called it "It's Been a Hard Day's Night," and then printed over this leather mask "The Cambridge Rapist," and started to mess around, started to print nude two cowboys who were nude from the waist down and with their penises almost touching each other at erection, and just make a little quote underneath to show that the music scene was played out, and so they would be talking to each other and say, "Here, Bill, what's happening? Where you going?" And he said, "I ain't going nowhere. It's all played out, John." And there was like a comment to show that there was nothing happening, but it was funny. And above it would say Saturday night, and you know, and I would constantly move. Well, the people that came to that store were all these dispossessed kids of Brian Ferry and David Bowie and The Sweet and Rod Stewart, and groups who were big in that moment, 1975. All these kids were looking for a style. They were the disaffected, the dispossessed. They didn't have a focus. These clothes suddenly began to excite them, and they would walk out, almost at the same time as the typical voyeur, who would be the Member of Parliament or would be some rubber fetishist. Those kids, out of those kids, I came a group that I created called the Sex Pistols.
Now, just talk a little bit about the Sex Pistols, if you will.
Well, the Sex Pistols were customers in that shop. They often tried to steal my clothes, some of them, the earlier guys, and I had to always run up the road and try and grab them by the throat. They were extraordinary, only in the sense that they were typical clothing thieves, that's what I would call them. These marvellous kids who really are not interested in anything else but grabbing style that could make them parade themselves in a way that made them look like they were happening. The great thing in England, and why style caught on in such a major way, was because that style itself was a way of stepping out. You stepped right out of of your grandfather's house, and you were looking like this festive peacock ready to be plucked. That attitude was always dominating the scene in terms of music. It was an attitude that everybody loved because it was the one thing they could do. If they couldn't play a guitar, they could at least put on a jacket. Well, those kids just wanted to get style. This was the new style. Nobody else was wearing it. It didn't look like anything else down the King's Road. Let's get at it. So I harboured this incredible cognoscenti, street thieving, almost Dickensian ragamuffin, very Oliver Twist-ish type characters. And I was becoming almost a Fagin. And these kids wanted to play music too. So I connected in the sense that and understood that the look with music would be great if it could work, but what music? And again, as destructive as those clothes were of the common way of going about looking, the music had to relate to it. The fact that they couldn't play their instruments but purely have the connivance and ability to thieve them from Keith Richards' house and Rod Stewart's house and break open the back doors of the Royal Court Theatre and steal all the orchestra's equipment. I went along one day, having got them a rehearsal room, only to discover this giant Aladdin's cave, where here were these guys who couldn't play one chord, but they had the most magnificent apparatus. Well, it was wonderful, and I thought that these guys have got such audacity and such terrific feeling for what I realised was in black vinyl, in those nude cowboy t-shirts, playing instruments that were obviously expensive, that they couldn't play more than one chord, screaming and shouting and hitting each other and whatever else their friends would do to rally and create a sort of agent provocateur atmosphere in there, in a club, would only ultimately ring in people's ears and create a scene that was, I suppose, very negative, but in its negativity, in terms of not associating itself with anything good, created a chaos in an audience who could dress up to mess up, enjoy the chaos, and make sure very clearly that it's their own. That became punk rock, and the Sex Pistols phenomenon caught on. Why? Because overnight, anybody could do it. All these kids could suddenly jump up on stage, thieve an instrument, do whatever, and bang away two chords. That's what happened, and it was wonderfully fresh, and everybody hated it in the industry, and every other group was prepared to cave in because this was in no way a follow-through of the roots of rock and roll. It was like too devastating, it was too wild, and it was too anarchic in the sense that it didn't pay homage to any peculiar rules. However, during the course of 18 months, they learned to play. The clothes themselves and the fashion dominated everything, and I think in many respects, the clothes and the attitude dominated and carried on long after the groups disappeared. And if you come to Melrose Avenue today, a very middle class, rather suburban Papaya Land Street, there you can locate the same look that's just travelled thousands of miles from a little store in the King's Road 10 years ago that is still spawning tiny little groups, because I think the clothes were charged with such an attitude that was as powerful as the attitude and the marriage of Christian Dior's mother to James Dean. Okay.
Okay. Let's talk a bit about fashion packaging. Briefly, if there was any about, you thought, conscious decision to package the Stones and the Beatles,
right,
and then going to talk about the Sex Pistols and sex.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Go on. What do you want me to lead?
About fashion packaging.
Well,
Was it consciously done for the Beatles, and then did you consciously do it for the Sex Pistols?
I think that it wasn't a conscious pattern, which was the look of Elvis Presley, the big colour group photograph of the Rolling Stones, and these giveaways that now and again appeared in various pop magazines and Fleet Street journals and whatever journals existed in America, were the early days really of merchandising rock and roll, and fashion photography and grooming suddenly started to loom on the horizon as group package with either group. I think that with respect to the Beatles, they were obviously aware at that time the image became very, very important. It was something that everybody could lock into. It was something that people could talk about. I think that the key with fashion in rock and roll success in terms of promoting, groups began to pet themselves. Makeup was always used on male performers, I think right back to Elvis Presley. But it became more flagrant. You'd flaunt it. You'd even perpetrate the idea of it as a style to look different. So you'd exaggerate it and you'd walk down the street with it. And groups like the Kinks, various singers or groups, was the fact that it's much more exciting to read about the group's image than to read about the group's music. You don't really want to read words that talk about the music. It's not interesting. The music is a given. If you haven't got the music, forget it anyway. So, in those days, they began to realize that what kids wanted to talk about was what they stuck up on their wall.